All right. So, Rose McDermott, award-winning political science experimentalist. Do you have a personal polygraph or related story you'd like to share?
Yeah, I had a series of polygraphs, 2 of them, back-to-back days, in like 1996. And it was at the CIA when I was interviewing for a job there, and it was pretty horrific. The first day, I was interviewed by an African-American woman, and the second day I was brought back and was interviewed by a white guy. And the first day, they had a bunch of us in a room, so the room was like a waiting room in a doctor's office, and we were all being interviewed for jobs, and we were all being polygraphed at the same time. We were brought into individual rooms, and then the next day, some of us who had failed were brought back to be interviewed a second time. And I was in that group, and I would say maybe half of the people were brought back the second day. And I wasn't sure if there were people in the first day where they had all passed or that they had just so clearly failed that they weren't brought back the next day, because they weren't brought back for other things either. And so it was unclear to me what was going on. But they put us in these rooms, and we were in these enormous chairs. It was like Lily Tomlin in Saturday Night Live, where your feet couldn't touch the ground, and you're like swinging your feet. And they put these blood pressure cuffs on that were really, really tight. I remember it being very, very painful. And these super bright lights in your eyes, and totally blank wall in front of you. And the part that really surprised me at first was that they sort of rehearsed you before they hooked you up. So they would say, these are the questions we're going to ask. It can only be a yes or no answer. So you can tell us, other things that wouldn't be part of yes or no answer, and then that'll make your yes or no answer not a lie. And so it had this kind of confessional aspect to it, like you were supposed to, say everything that wouldn't be covered under yes or no. And I had done a version of a similar one many years prior, but it was on the phone. So I had interviewed for a job in the CIA in 1984 when I was finishing college. Condi Rice had told me I should interview for a job with the CIA, and so I did, and I took the written test and everything, and got to a certain point, and then they called me up on the phone. And there wasn't any, interrogation in terms of, obviously over the phone they couldn't do galvanic skin response or anything like that. But I remember then in 1984, all the questions were about drug use and homosexual behavior. So it was all like, how much pot have you smoked? How much blow have you snorted? How much heroin have you shot? And then like incredibly weird questions about sexual behavior. And when I say weird, it wasn't just like your normal, like, oh, have you slept with women? But, have you slept with a dog? Have you slept with a cat? Have you slept with a sheep? And I remember there were like 8 questions about different animals. Like, can't you just say animal? No, it had to be, like cow. It was just very bizarre. So I was expecting those kinds of questions when I went back in 1996. And when I went back in 1996, they were all questions about terrorism. So they were all questions about, have you ever been part of a terrorist organization? Like, there weren't any of the drug questions, there weren't any of the sex questions, so the content of the questions had really changed. But there was another woman who was in the group with me who had to go back a third day. Now, I didn't have to go back the third day. And she was applying for a job with the counterterrorism unit. And she said that she thought that she had failed because she looked too excited. And I said, well, what do you mean? And she's like, well, this is really interesting to me, and I really like this work, and I find it really intellectually stimulating, and I think that I look too excited. And there was another guy who was clearly an alcoholic because he, we all had to do a urinalysis that day, and by the end of that day, he definitely was starting to have the DTs, and you could tell he was like really struggling. And then went home that night, and you could tell he like drank really heavily, and the next day had to come back and do the polygraph. And he was, the second day, I think, pretty drunk when he was doing it, and so I think that that probably made his baseline level, more calm. But I found it really painful physically, like just the bright lights, the really tight blood pressure machine. But I also found it quite psychologically invasive. And the woman who did my interview the first time was extremely hostile. I felt like her whole demeanor, her body language, her vocal intonations started with an assumption of me being a bad person or me being out to lie to her or being, I don't know, a terrorist. I don't know what she was thinking, but she was quite hostile in her interrogation. And I know that when they asked, they had a really hard time getting a baseline on me. So they'd say things like, "Is your name Rose McDermott?" And I'd go, "Yes." And you'd see the machine go, "Are you 33? Yes." And then so pretty soon I was like, well, maybe I'm not Rose McDermott. Maybe I'm lying. Maybe I'm really not 33. Maybe I'm really not, whatever it was. And I really found myself having this kind of existential crisis by the end of it because it went on forever. It was like 4 hours. And the second day it was shorter, maybe like 3 hours. But for 10 questions that were yes or no questions, it was like this incredible half-day ordeal. And by the end, I definitely had this existential moment of like, what's the truth? What's a lie? Am I who I say I am? Maybe I'm not who I say I am. Maybe I really am what you think I am. It was definitely a fraught experience. And I don't think it had any sense of accuracy about, in any systematic way, across people in terms of being able to tell people who were lying, or also people who might be telling the truth but have different physiological responses to things for other reasons. Maybe you're sweating a lot because you're having a bad estrogen day. It's not clear to me that across individuals it's an accurate indicator of anything meaningful about deception, especially if somebody sets out to deceive it.
Right. Have you witnessed any additional polygraphs or heard about anyone else's polygraph experience?
Just the group that I went through. I didn't witness them, but people talked about it incessantly. It was definitely a traumatic experience. Like after it was over, people, definitely that was the thing they talked about. They didn't talk about the medical exam. They didn't talk about so it was an all-day event, and there were other aspects of the interview. You had a psychological battery, an MMPI. You had medical tests, hearing, vision. They actually did an HIV test without asking permission, which back in those days was illegal. And I didn't even know they had done it until like 3 weeks later. I get this note in the mail, and I opened it up, and it's like, here's your results. And I'm like, isn't this kind of illegal? Like, first of all, you didn't tell me you were doing it. Secondly, I kind of think that they're supposed to like have a person tell you, but it just came in the mail. And it was fine, but I can imagine like, if that's the way you actually found out you had a bad disease like hepatitis or HIV, that getting the note in the mail would be kind of bad. But no one talked about any of that stuff. No one talked about the blood draw or, any of the psychological batteries. You had to meet with a shrink. No one talked about that. No one talked about the individual meetings you had with division chairs for, you're going to work in the China section, you're going to work in the arms control section, none of that. And all the discussion was about the polygraph, and everybody found it incredibly uncomfortable and upsetting. And there was a lot of discussion about it, but I didn't actually witness those. It was just the talk, like the woman who said she thought she had failed because she was too excited, and you sort of saw who had to come back and who didn't have to come back, but you didn't know why. And it was very interesting because some people definitely got interviewed by the same polygraph person twice, and other people had different people interview them. So I had a different person, but there were at least 2 other people who got interviewed by the same person. Like you saw them one day and then you saw them come back the next day. And I don't know how they decided who got interviewed by the same person and who got switched out.
Right. Excuse me. Sorry. So Phil Zimbardo, who you've collaborated with on a number of projects, is a strong proponent of situationism. So there was a CIA program in the 80s, informally called Operation Bad Apples, that weeded out polygraphers who were falsifying confessions, falsifying charts. And I think Professor Zimbardo would be inclined to say, these are not bad apples, these are bad barrels.
Right.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I've actually talked to him about the polygraph. I talked to him about the polygraph when I took it, and he said, well, this is ridiculous. And he's like, here's how you cheat it. And I'm like, I'm not trying to cheat it. And he's like, no, here's how you cheat it. He said the thing that you have to do is you have to raise your baseline level of tension. So the way that you can apparently cheat it is when they ask you questions like your name or your age or whatever, you squeeze your toes. So you can't see it if you squeeze your toes. Well, you can in these shoes, but you know, if you crunch up your toes, it raises your baseline level just enough so that then when you relax your toes and tell a lie, you look like you're at the same baseline level. So there's apparently, and you can do it, I'm sure, with other large muscle groups as long as it's not, you know, visible, but that's the easiest way to do it. I said, no, I'm not trying to cheat this. I just, you know, don't believe it. And he's like, oh, it's bullshit. I mean, you can't use it in court, you know, so on and so forth. And he really sees it as a, you know, as a systematic mechanism that these institutions use to keep people under control. That it's really the situation or the institution that's trying to enforce a particular kind of authority and Big Brother surveillance. So, you know, we're watching you, we're going to know. It's like the bad Santa Claus, you know, I know your good things and your bad things, right? And we're going to keep track. So, you know, you're not going to fall out of line because we're going to keep on top of you. But the problem is that I think the people you're most likely to catch are people who actually are good people who will feel upset about lying, whereas those who systematically set out to deceive the system are going to be those most successful at doing it. So, you know, Aldrich Ames was not caught on a polygraph. You know, the other people who've been found to lie, both in the FBI and CIA, passed numerous polygraphs with no indication that they were lying, and they were found on forensic accounting. You know, gee, where'd this extra $3 million come in? And so it's not clear to me that it really serves anything other than a mechanism of social control. And I see it as really the you know, and I know Phil Zimbardo sees it this way too, as, you know, the institutional instantiation of control, of social control. And it is a top-down thing. It's a you know, it's a bad barrel. It's not bad apples. You're putting good apples into a rotten barrel, they're going to turn rotten. And that's what's really going on.
That's sort of consistent with the stories that I've heard from people, particularly in the CIA, but also in other agencies, who've been polygraphed out and told stories of this tool, the polygraph, being used to get rid of people who are speaking out about corruption.
Yes.
They're whistleblowers even if they're sanctioned whistleblowers, for example, publishing a book that the agency didn't like.
Right.
This will get you polygraphed out, and that will be the way in which you're not fired, you just don't have the clearance anymore to do your job.
Well, and when you were saying about it being an art versus a science, part of what I realize happens and how they do that to polygraph you out is this preparation before they actually run you through the polygraph. So they'll say, I'm going to ask you if you take any drugs. But that's not going to include medication. But it's only not going to include medication if you tell me the medication you're taking. Right? So you basically have to fess up to all the medication you're taking. And then when they ask you, do you take drugs, you can say no, because they'll say, aside from what we've already discussed, do you take medication or do you take drugs? And so what they're really doing is bracketing out all the potentially disturbing things, and that's the information I think they're after. So that then when they give you the polygraph, but then when you get polygraphed out, what they're actually using is not your answer to the polygraph, it's all the information you gave prior in order to pass the polygraph, and I think that's the information that they then use against you. And that's the part that I don't think gets discussed very much, is what happens to that information, the bracketed, aside from what we discussed information, who gets access to that? And yet you're required to produce that if you're going to successfully pass this hoop. So it really does have that kind of, you know, confessionary quality to it. Tell us your sins, and then here's your penance, and then you get to go back into society to sin no more, you know. and we're going to make sure you don't sin anymore because we're going to do this to you once a year or however often they're going to do it to you. And so it has that, I think, that social control element.
So I don't know if you have as much to say about this one. If not, that's fine. But you've also published work with Professor Zimbardo on the political psychological effects of repeated terror alerts.
Oh, right.
Sorry. So what do you know, or what would you expect the psychological consequences to be of repeated exposures to terrorism threats as experienced by security screening professionals like polygraphers?
Yeah, you know, that's really interesting. I think that, I mean, there's two things that occur to me. One is, when I did that work with Phil Zimbardo, one of the most interesting aspects was Con Edison had taken an enormous amount of survey information from their workers who worked in and around Ground Zero around the time of 9/11. They had started with a mental health survey prior to 9/11 for some other reason, and then were able to continue it. And a lot of those workers had to work in and around the region right after the attacks because they were repairing all the phone lines and cable lines and everything that went down. And a lot of them ended up having to be, retired on medical disability for their exposure to all kinds of inhalants and things that hurt their lungs. But the most remarkable aspect of those findings, and Con Edison initially released it and then clamped down and pulled the data back, but we actually got it before they pulled it back. And what it showed was, you know, partly what you'd expect, which is this habituation over time. So the alarm goes up from, you know, let's call it orange to red. You initially get some reaction to that, but over time people habituate to that. That's very similar to what you see in Israel when you have repeated exposure attacks to terrorist alerts. But the remarkable thing was people got really, really anxious when the alerts were reduced. So when it would go from red to orange or from orange to yellow. And what we discovered looking at the other data they were collecting is that what it was it was a salient reminder to them of a threat that they had sort of forgotten about. So it wasn't just being told you need to be more scared, but even being told you could be less scared reminds you that there's a fear that's out there that you should pay attention to, and it sort of pings people in a way that keeps them agitated. And I think what happens with polygraphers, or the guys I think of the same way are all the guys at TSA when you go through the screening and security when you go on planes, is it's an incredibly boring job, right? You're basically doing the same thing all day, every day. And the probability that you're going to find something bad is really low, but the consequences if you miss it are really bad and they're really high. But basically, you're bored, and you have to pay attention, meticulous attention to detail, being incredibly bored. And the only people who are really good at that are like Buddhist monks and Carmelite nuns, right, who study open attention, or people who abuse pro-vigil. I mean, those are the only people who are going to be able to keep up that attention for like 8 hours. And so they find ways to amuse themselves, right? Like LAX is the best place where it happens, where they make everybody, like if you have a thing of soda, they're going to make you put the soda thing there, and nobody can have that soda. But you can't actually throw the soda away. Now, why can't you throw the soda away? Because they're taking all that shit home, right? Like they're stealing that stuff. The stuff that you actually have to throw away goes in a barrel, but the stuff they steal goes on a table. And it's not just soda, it's shampoo, it's like all this really expensive stuff. So it's exploiting the surplus of the society, right? I mean, it's not accidental. And then who gets profiled with the, hands pat down? It's not who a behavioral psychologist would say should be profiled. And I don't mean like on ethnic grounds. I mean like a single 35-year-old guy who looks like he might be a threat. No, who gets patted down are the 20-year-old beautiful blonde babes, right? Because it's like these guys would never be able to put their hands on women like this any other way. And yeah, sure, you can wait for the female security guard, but she's not going to get there for 20 minutes because they're not going to call her for 20 minutes because they know your flight is in 20 minutes. So if you want to get through, you're going to have to get patted down by that guy. I mean, they find ways to amuse themselves because they're bored, and this is the way they're going to exploit their power. And I think the same thing happens with polygraphs. They're bored. There's a really low probability they're going to find anything. It's really bad if they don't. But they're going to find ways to amuse themselves. And the way that they do that is to exploit their power over people who are vulnerable and can't fight back. And I think that that's exactly, the way that they amuse themselves to keep from basically boring themselves to tears. I mean, I think that's what's going on. I could be wrong, but that's my sense of it.
The boredom motive.
Yes, the boredom motive. The boredom and exploitation motive.
Yeah. So in the FBI alone, the number of polygraph exams conducted solely in connection with pre-employment and employee security screenings rose nearly 750% from 2002 to 2005.
That's just shocking.
Really?
I think that's a lot. Don't you think that's a lot?
It's not.
That's a
yeah.
lot.
Yeah, it's not a 100 or 200%
Yeah,
jump.
no,
It's
that's a lot.
750% increase.
It's like a make-work program.
Right. And I was wondering if there were any causes or consequences that you would associate with that really notable skyrocketing.
I mean, obviously it comes out of, kind of 9/11 and that threat. But some of it strikes me as make-work, right? I mean, TSA is make-work. It's the, 2000 version of the Work Projects Administration that Roosevelt had, right? I mean, you have all these people, you have a bad economy, you have to put them to work. Well, you may as well have them, in this job as well as any other job. Personally, I think it would be better building infrastructure, like rebuilding schools and highways and bridges and things, but our society decides to be defended against fear. And I think that as a cause, I think that's the cause, is this kind of continual activation of fear in society. And I think the media contributes to it, especially because Fox News and all these other kinds of 24-hour news stations need to get ratings, and part of how they do it is by things that activate people and sensationalize things, and fear is a really effective way to do it. I think the consequences are subtle but quite invasive. I think that people who are in these jobs start to see people in their own society as enemies. So it ruptures a kind of collective cohesion in society, a kind of whatever remnants of in-group membership might have happened after 9/11, where everybody had flags and everybody was in it together. All of a sudden, we're not in it together. We're each other. We're threats to each other, and kind of starting with an assumption that everybody could be a potential threat, I think really ruptures social cohesion in a way that doesn't really get properly addressed.
Speaking of in-groups and out-groups, I've done some experiments on racial and confirmation bias separately in polygraph chart interpretation, and I'm interested in exploring their interaction, but there's something about thinking about that problem that bothers me conceptually, and that is that I'm not sure they're really different types of bias. Because in
what
the
are
sense
different
that
types of bias?
racial and confirmation bias.
Oh, right.
I'm wondering if all forms of, be it racial or gendered or sexuality, whatever particular bias might be filtering through this pseudoscientific tool, I'm wondering if it's all based on cultural stereotypes, if it's all a form, a subset of confirmation bias.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that what it's picking up on is, what psychologists would think of as in-group, out-group bias, right? So that's going to be different for every person, right? If you're white, it's going to be in-group is white, out-group is non-white. If you're female, in-group is female, out-group is male, and so on and so forth. If you're Jewish, out-group is going to be, not Jewish. I mean, whatever that division is of your identity, out-group is going to be not me. And so I think that whatever form that takes, cultural, linguistic, religious, ethnic, racial, that you're really tapping into an underlying disposition that's about how comfortable you are with in-groups and how uncomfortable you are with out-groups. From the experimental research I've seen, the one really fundamental categorization, so the three sets of fundamental categorizations that psychologists typically talk about are age, sex, and race. Age meaning like a baby isn't an 80-year-old. And when they look at experiments that try to manipulate the extent to which you can get rid of those things, there's a really famous experiment by Rob Kurzban called Can Race Be Erased, where he crosses racial identity with coalitional status, so that you have members who are part of a different race but are part of your team, and you can get rid of racial effects in an hour. I mean, you really get people being very concerned about in-group status and not racial status. The thing you can't ever get rid of are sex differences. There's just no way you can do it. So people will always recognize sex difference above and beyond coalitional status. It's just too fundamental to, I think, our reproductive psychology. I think age is also one of those things. You're just going to know that a baby isn't an 80-year-old. I mean, that there's different levels of attention and need that especially young children require. But other kinds of categorizations, I think, are the byproducts of a very fundamental categorization, which is about in-group, out-group behavior. And importantly, there's recent evidence showing that that's not specific to humans, that monkeys do it, that there's actually a phylogenetic basis in primate behavior that distinguishes in-groups from out-groups. And so there's probably a really quite ancient evolutionary imperative that privileged survival among those who could carefully distinguish in-groups from out-groups.
So in terms of making implicit bias explicit and making it go away, you might be hopeful that we can do that with racial bias.
Right.
In polygraphs or in any
Yes.
other context, but less so with gender.
I agree with that, yeah. And I think that you could probably get rid of it with religion or culture or any of these kinds of things that could be crossed with coalitional status. But I think that you just can't ever get rid of it with sex. It's just too fundamental.
That's a shame. I'll probably cut this part, but that's a shame because it's really a shame because it's not as socially acceptable to say there's sexism going on here and you need to stop, as opposed to there's racism going on and we don't do that here.
Right. Well, and I think part of the reason it's not as acceptable is because it's harder, right? There's a way in which people go, yeah, it's kind of not really okay to categorize people by race. But I think deep down people think it's kind of okay to categorize people by sex. And I think it's one of the reasons that our laws, which are so focused on equity, often do not achieve justice when it comes to issues around sexual discrimination and sexual harassment. So giving a man 9 months for his wife being pregnant is equity, but it's not just. She just has more demands on her when she's pregnant than he does. Takes more calories, takes more energy. It's harder work. It's harder work to be pregnant. It's harder work to lactate. Justice would look like more accommodations to her, not equal accommodations to her. But we as a society have a very, very difficult time with anything that is not equal, even when it's not just. And I think that comes out of a history of horrible slavery in America, which has brightly instantiated an important attention to equity in race that does not always constitute justice in sex.
In the sense that, I'm sorry.
No, that's all. In the sense that what?
I was just thinking it's in the sense that you can sort of think of a racing race in a literal way.
Yes.
And saying, look, these entities are the same, a white person and a black person with the same abilities, different skin color. There's no substantive difference in these physical beings.
That's right.
Much less in their capabilities. But with gender, you can't do that. We
Right.
really will always have different capabilities, different structures on average, different
Well,
needs.
different incentives, different goals, different needs, and In many, many ways, men and women are similar. I'm not saying that they are divergent in all ways, but they will always have different reproductive agendas, and that will influence enormous aspects of cognition, attention, behavior, memory, goals, incentives, and particularly attachment styles and structures. They're just going to be different. Not better, not worse, just different. And that piece, I think, is very difficult to erase.
Interesting. So there's not been any recent experimental research that I can find on bias in polygraphs. And I was wondering if some of your work on gender differences in aggression might be relevant.
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's so much relevant. What I was thinking about is there is quite a lot of research that looks at the race and sex of interviewers when they do interviewing. So these are not so much hostile interviews like polygraphs, but interviewing just for getting information from people. And there's been, even in politics in the American National Election Studies, when you go to someone's house, you're affected. A white person interviewing a black person is going to get different results than a white person interviewing a white person. And similarly, a man interviewing a man is going to get a different answer than a man interviewing a woman. And I think that literature on race and sex in interviews is relevant to polygraphs, although the context is quite different because it's not hostile. The original work that I'm aware of examining these effects came out of the original face-to-face interviews that the Kinsey people did in the sex research in the 50s, where they were looking at, are people going to be more honest on the phone or writing stuff down or talking face-to-face? And they were shocked to realize that they felt like they really got the most honest answers in these face-to-face interviews, and that became the kind of gold standard, not just for those interviews, but for political interviews and other kinds of socially sanctioned topics, because you could sort of read body language, you could tell if people were lying, you could tell, sort of try to elicit more information. And then I think people started to do more research into, is a man more likely to be honest with a man? One of the things I do know that I remember when I did the CIA interviews is the people who got in and out of there the fastest, like they were waiting in the bus and didn't have to come back the second day, was these, white conservative men being interviewed by white conservative men. They were out of there. It was a really different discourse, I think, than the other kinds of things. And it was very interesting to me that when I was interviewed the first day, they obviously, were trying to match me by sex by having a woman interview me. She was a different race. And it didn't work. And so the next day they had a guy interview me who was the same race. Now he was nicer, and the second day was easier for me, maybe partly because I was prepared, but I think just because he was nicer. And I do think that they systematically alter race and sex when they do polygraph exams to see how, that changes people's responses, particularly when they have people come back more than once.
Right. So one main criticism of university research on polygraphs is that federal polygraphers are specially trained scientists, and therefore academics cannot generalize from any general population sample they can get, maybe even from a state licensed polygrapher population sample like I have in Virginia, to get, sort of what would that particular population of federal polygraphers or polygraphers on average, including federal and state licensed and private folks. So the argument is that one cannot approximate from the general population to the polygrapher population because I can't train people like they do at DACA or at, now it's they keep changing the name. It was DODP and then it was DACA and now it's the National Center for Credibility Assessment. Anyway.
What a great name. That's like total doublespeak, George Orwell.
Right. But anyway, I can't train people like they do at NCAA since what they do is secret.
Right.
Is this a persuasive argument against non-governmental, non-industry affiliated polygraph research?
Well, I love how whenever they don't want to tell you something, it's because it's too secret to tell you. It's just whenever there's lack of transparency, it makes me skeptical. It seems to be one of these systems that's unfalsifiable, like, Catholicism or psychoanalysis. If it doesn't fall in line with the theoretical prescriptions, then it's because you're just not trying hard enough. You know, you described one of the federal prosecutors or one of the federal polygraphers as somebody who had a high school science education. That doesn't seem impossible to recreate with a particular set of training among college students, right? I mean, if in fact they're taking people and training them who have high school science things, you should be able to train them regardless. But I think it's less about looking at who the polygraphers are and more at looking at who the subjects are. So if you get different results among polygraphers who are federal polygraphers versus, so you take the same population, you have them examined by federal polygraphers, you have them examined by state polygraphers, and you have them examined by people you train. And if you get different results, that may tell you something interesting and important. So you can go at it the back end too. You don't just have to look at people who are doing the polygraphy. You can look at people who are being polygraphied. And I think that would be the right way to do the comparison, because that would also allow you to show faults or mistakes on the part of the federal people as likely as you would on the part of the state people or whoever.
Right.
So I don't think that that's a credible justification for not doing it.
So let's just assume that polygraphs are, I think the words that you used before were they're this top-down way of allowing the in-group to really maintain and reinforce in-group cohesion.
And social control, yeah.
And social control while keeping the out-group out.
Yeah.
Let's assume that's the case and out-group is defined however a particular polygrapher defines it, be that in terms of gender, race, nationality, sexuality,
Whistleblower.
political views, whistleblower, whatever. What function do polygraphs serve in relation to national security? Is there a positive function?
I think it's a selection mechanism. You know, it's a seemingly objective way to justify why you choose the people you choose to join the community and why you exclude other people without having to resort to socially sanctioned categories like race, right? So you don't say, oh, we really don't want black people. You just say, well, you failed the polygraph, right? Technology did it. It wasn't something that somebody has to own in a particular way. So when the CIA grew out of the Office of Security Studies, or the Office of Strategic Security in the Second World War, and that organization got its credibility from doing a psychobiography of Adolf Hitler. Walter Langer did it. And then they decided to build the CIA, and Allen Dulles was the first head of it, and they had the FBI, and it was J. Edgar Hoover, and they had their own different kind of ethics about how they would do things for various reasons. But in those early days, when they were soliciting people to work in OSS and later CIA, it was very much an old boys network. It was professors who took their favorite students at Ivy League universities to join the club. It was done through informal networks on handshake. You were chosen. And you were chosen not just because you were at Harvard or you were at Yale or whatever, but because you were a certain type. You came from a wealthy family, maybe a politically connected family. You were white, you were male, you were Protestant, you were whatever you were. And you were part of a group of people who understood each other. And this group was understood not only to understand each other, but to be genuinely committed to the protection of the larger society, right? So the problem is that model could not be sustained over time in an equitable democratic system where everybody has a belief that open access should be based on merit. And yet, they really want people they can quote unquote trust. And the legacy and the path development of the initial creation of these institutions was really about having these close-knit groups of people who understand each other, right? So now, yeah, you have a few more women, you may have a few more minorities, but they're still of a particular educational background, of a particular maybe social class, by and large. I mean, there's exceptions. Now, I would argue that the downside of that is it really increases the odds of a kind of groupthink. You're not going to be able to see outside the box. You're not going to be able to understand cultures or motives or groups or incentives that aren't part of your own experience. And if you don't have that within your group and your agency, it's very, very difficult to be able to anticipate novel threats, right? So you're always looking over your shoulder. Why do we have the TSA? Because, 9/11 was planes that went into buildings. Well, we're not putting as much time and effort into things that haven't happened yet because we can't imagine them. And yet, you can be sure that the terrorists are thinking about things like that. They're not like, oh, I'm going to go to whatever the most hardened target is. I blew up a plane before. They've really hardened the planes. I'm going to go after a plane. You're going to go after what's not been examined. And that inability to think outside the box in intelligence, I think, is a direct result of the kinds of analysts that are recruited and the way that they are screened and selected by processes like the polygraph, which people can hide behind as an objective, technological, morally detached mechanism that decides who isn't trustworthy, but really serves as a filter to let in our kind, whatever our kind is. And I think that that's the function it serves. And I think it's detrimental in really fundamental ways to maximizing prospects for national security, particularly when the threat comes from cultures who may not be embodied within that organization.
One of the primary arguments of polygraph proponents has been that the continued use of polygraphs comes down to this opposition between national security and individual liberty or comfort. Do you think that's a false opposition, or do you think that's a real choice that we're making in relation to programs like polygraphs?
I think that we construct that opposition. I think that we create an artificial opposition. I think that's what the Patriot Act is. I mean, I don't think its only embodiment is polygraphs, although I think polygraphs are an example of it. I think that any society truly committed to democracy does not try to restrict it at home in order to advance it abroad. That seems like a complete perversion to me. And I think if you really, really want to maximize national security, you do it through sets of activities, like forensic accounting, for example, that take place behind the scenes, that are prophylactic, that are attentive to the goals and incentives that your opposition wants. Money, territory, mates, whatever it happens to be. And that doing it through these performative things, like the screeners at the airport, like polygraphs, is a way to give people false security, and I think ultimately undermines not only our true security, but the fundamental democratic principles on which our society should be founded, and to which we all agreed in this, Lockean liberal experiment that we call democracy. And I feel like every time that contrast is made, it's an excuse for the powerful and rich to exploit the minority by using their fear to get them to act against their interest for the financial and strategic and power benefit of the privileged.
What about the other main polygraph proponent argument that, excuse me, what about the other main polygraph proponent argument that this tool, this credibility assessment tool, polygraphs, is imperfect, but we can't just take it away because we would have nothing to replace it with?
We absolutely can take it away because it's useless. I mean, if something doesn't work, taking it away is not going to harm you. Just because we don't have a replacement doesn't mean that we should. To me, that argument is like saying, okay, I have a bunch of condoms, I stuck a bunch of needles through them, but you know what? It's better than nothing. It's not better than nothing. It is nothing. It's nothing, only it's uncomfortable, right? It's like, why should you have something that doesn't work and that hurts, right? You only do it because it works. And if you can show that it doesn't work, then why should you have it? Now, it's an imperfect analogy because there's other forms of birth control besides condoms, but when you think about national security, there are other tools that we have besides polygraphs. And those tools involve our military forces, our police forces, you know, forensic accounting. When you look at how, for example, Turkey took down the PKK, they did it through traditional policing. They didn't do it through polygraphing everybody in society. They did it through, you know, careful policing in concert with political changes that allowed the opposition to have a voice in the